Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some really fascinating stuff today. I think it's something a lot of us have wondered about, especially when we're trying to make sense of the mental health landscape.
Hmm?
Like, why are there so few autistic therapists out there?
Right. You'd think, especially with all the talk about representation and lived experience, that we'd see more of them. It's actually kind of surprising.
It is, and it's a point that Bridget Hamster brought up really powerfully in her LinkedIn article, remember? It's like, imagine a mental health care system where autistic and neurodivergent therapists are front and center, you know,
Mm-hmm.
care built on genuine shared experiences and real solidarity.
Absolutely. That resonated so much with me. And it ties in perfectly with what Jaime Hoerricks has been writing about, which is what we're going to unpack today. Hoerricks really champions that vision of neurodivergent-led care, but they also point out a really uncomfortable truth. Our current systems make that vision incredibly difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to dig into in this deep dive. Why does this system, the one that's supposed to be about supporting mental well-being, seem to struggle so much with fully embracing neurodivergent therapists and their approaches to care? We're even going to use some frameworks like the power threat, meaning framework PTMF for short, and even some concepts from a Marxist perspective to try to understand what's really going on.
That's good to me.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with this fundamental misalignment that Hoerricks talks about between traditional therapy and these more radical approaches.
Yeah, good place to start. Traditional therapy models, they often come from this medical perspective, right? And the question they're trying to answer is, what is wrong with this person? Like, what's the diagnosis?
Right, so they're trying to find the problem within the individual, right. But the PTMF flips that, doesn't it? Instead of looking for what's wrong, it asks something else entirely.
Totally. PTMF pushes us to ask, what has happened to you? Like, what are the life experiences that have shaped you? How did those events affect you? And then what meaning did you make of those experiences? And so importantly, what was your response? It moves away from seeing distress as like a personal failing, and instead it tries to understand it as a response to life, to difficult circumstances, to the power dynamics in someone's world.
Okay, so instead of saying you have anxiety, PTMF might ask, what stressful or traumatic things have you gone through, and how did this anxiety maybe develop as a way to cope? That seems like such a different way to look at things.
It is, and if we connect that back to society's view of mental health, you start to see some tension. The medical model often focuses on changing the individual, like let's fix what's wrong with you. But PTMF really brings those broader societal forces into the picture. It wants us to consider things like poverty, discrimination, or lack of opportunity, and how they might be contributing to someone's distress.
And this is where I think the Marxist perspective comes in, right?
Yeah.
And things get really interesting when we think about why this system might not be so keen on having more neurodivergent therapists around. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, from a Marxist standpoint, capitalism, the way our economic system is set up, it really impacts how we view and deal with mental health. The primary goal under capitalism isn't necessarily everyone's overall well-being or liberation. Instead, there's this push to get people back to being productive, back into the workforce.
So the focus, even unintentionally, can shift from genuine care and support to, I don't know, making sure people can contribute to the economy. That's kind of a tough pill to swallow when we're talking about something as personal as mental health.
Right. And within that framework, care can almost become about enforcing compliance, like getting people to fit back into the system. And
Correct.
healing, well, that can get twisted into conforming to what society expects of a so-called productive person.
Okay, so how do neurodivergent therapists, how do they challenge that system? Why might their presence be seen as a threat to that whole focus on compliance?
Because they often have a very different idea of what normal is and what well-being truly means. If you have therapists who understand neurodivergence, not as something broken that needs fixing, but as a natural part of human diversity, that directly challenges the system that profits from pathologizing difference.
It's like saying, hey, maybe not everyone needs to be cured or made neurotypical to be healthy and valuable.
Exactly.
So this whole historical way that autism and other neurodivergences have been framed as deficits, as disorders, that plays a huge role here, doesn't it? It kind of helps maintain this system we're talking about.
Absolutely. Framing autism as a deficit rather than just a variation in how brains work. It really reflects the priorities of the dominant neurotypical culture. It becomes a way to control difference and reinforce what they see as normal.
If you label a set of traits as a disorder, it justifies all sorts of interventions, right?
Yes.
Things aimed at minimizing those traits.
Yeah.
It's like, also trying to erase those differences.
That's it. And that links back to the PTMF, right? When you label autistic traits as symptoms, you're essentially saying these differences are dysfunctions that need fixing. It's like,
Yeah.
instead of just recognizing that some people communicate or process information differently, the system wants to label that as a problem.
So things like social skills training, which often prioritizes neurotypical ways of interacting, even if those aren't natural or comfortable for the autistic person.
Exactly. And when you look at some of those interventions like social skills training, behavior modification, even things like forcing eye contact or suppressing stimming, it starts to feel less like genuine support and more like, I don't know.
Techniques of control?
Yeah, techniques of control. The goal isn't always the well-being or the authenticity of the autistic person. Sometimes it feels more about making them fit in, making them more acceptable in neurotypical environments like schools and workplaces.
So even though those interventions are often presented as being helpful, they might actually be more about serving the needs of the institution rather than the individual.
Yeah, and that's a really tough thing to grapple with, right? I mean, these interventions can be designed to reduce behaviors that are seen as disruptive or to encourage behaviors that are normal, but it prioritizes the system over the individual. And from a PTMF perspective, these interventions can even be seen as a response to the perceived threat of autistic people not conforming to those expectations.
And the impact on autistic people themselves, it must be huge. Imagine the constant pressure to mask your natural behaviors, to constantly try to fit in. It's exhausting.
It is, and it can lead to so much internalized shame, to increased anxiety, and eventually burnout. They're constantly expending energy trying to be someone they're not.
Okay, so the article we're discussing also talks about this idea of the mental health system being an ideological state apparatus. That sounds a bit academic, to be honest. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. This draws from Marxist thought, and the idea is that institutions in society, like the mental health system, they aren't really neutral. They function in ways that support the dominant social order and the underlying capitalist system. They help keep things running the way they are.
So it's not just about addressing individual mental health. It's also about maintaining power structures in society.
Exactly. And in a capitalist system, health is often tied to an individual's ability to work, to be productive. If you can work and contribute to the economy, you're generally seen as healthy. But those who, maybe because of cognitive, emotional, or sensory differences, struggle to meet those expectations, they risk being labeled disordered or defective, further marginalizing them within that system.
And this all ties into that idea of the ideal worker, right? The kind of worker that many workplaces just assume everyone should be.
Yes. The ideal worker is often imagined as someone who's always on time, always follows the rules, is super sociable, processes information in a linear way, and can regulate their emotions perfectly under pressure. Many autistic individuals might find those expectations challenging, to say the least. Not because they lack ability, but because their brains work differently.
But instead of questioning whether that whole ideal worker model is even realistic or fair,
the system pathologizes their differences. It says, you're the problem because you don't fit this mold. And therapists, sometimes without even realizing it, can become what are called gatekeepers of normalcy. They end up guiding people back towards those behaviors and ways of thinking that allow them to fit back into the system.
it almost sounds like therapy, in some cases, becomes a tool for social control instead of being about individual well-being and freedom.
It's definitely something to think about. And then, we've seen this rise in behavioral therapies like ABA and the use of medication, all happening alongside the growing commercialization of mental health.
Right. And the article uses this term, the autism industry, which I found really striking. Can you explain what that means?
It refers to all the services, products, and professionals that have popped up around autism. You've got therapy clinics, pharmaceutical companies, educational consultants. You name it, there's a lot of money involved, and that can create a situation where the priorities, well, they don't always align with what's best for autistic people.
And there have been some serious concerns raised about certain interventions, haven't there? Like the potential for ABA to be traumatic, or how medication might just suppress behaviors without addressing the root causes of the distress.
Absolutely valid concerns. These industries are operating within a capitalist system, and that system seeks to monetize everything, including difference and distress. It's like treating autism becomes another way to generate profit, and that can come at the expense of truly listening to and valuing autistic people's experiences.
So taking all this into account, it's no wonder that autistic and neurodivergent therapists are seen as a challenge to the system.
They are. They challenge the established way of doing things. They question the pathologization of neurodivergent ways of being. And they offer a kind of solidarity that comes from shared experience. They get it, you know? They understand that distress in neurodivergent people can come from oppression and lack of acceptance, not just some internal flaw. And their very presence questions the authority of a system that says it knows how everyone should think and feel.
It's like a direct challenge to that control that traditional therapy often tries to exert.
It is. And that can be threatening to a system that's built on maintaining control, on making money, and on upholding neurotypical norms as the gold standard. It's not easy for the system to accommodate these therapists because it would require giving up some of that control and admitting that maybe neurotypical perspectives aren't the only valid ones.
It would mean really questioning what we consider professionalism and competence in the mental health field.
Right. Neurodivergent professionals are often perceived as less competent, less stable, or less professional. Not because they actually are, but because their way of being, their communication, or their sensory needs might be different from neurotypical expectations. And their insights and experiences can be dismissed or minimized as a result.
Which brings us back to that Marxist critique of how capitalism undervalues certain kinds of labor.
Totally.
Yeah.
Under capitalism, labor is valued based on its ability to generate profit. And the unique skills and perspectives that neurodivergent people have, including their potential as therapists, they're often overlooked because they don't fit neatly into those standardized, profit-driven models.
And neurodivergent therapists often have more relational, flexible approaches, right? They're less focused on those strict, measurable outcomes that the system likes.
Exactly. And those approaches can be harder to quantify, to package, and sell. Their emphasis on client autonomy and understanding systemic barriers, it challenges the control mechanisms within the mental health industry. It's like a quiet rebellion against the dominant way of doing things.
So, if the current system has all these limitations and biases, what's the alternative? The material mentions liberation and collective care.
It's about moving away from this profit-driven, compliance-focused model and towards one that truly values lived experience and different perspectives. It's about prioritizing community-led care, peer support, mutual aid, spaces that exist outside the traditional capitalist way of providing services.
Spaces where neurodivergence isn't just tolerated, it's actually seen as valuable.
Yes. And if we think back to the PTMF, it's about reframing our experiences, not as personal failures or disorders, but as understandable responses to power dynamics and oppression. And from a Marxist perspective, healthcare, including mental health care, should be a public good, accessible to everyone, not something you buy and sell for profit.
So maybe the way forward involves not just trying to reform the current system, but also dismantling certain aspects of it and building something entirely new, something grounded in collective care and the acceptance of different ways of being.
Exactly. It's about dismantling those systems of control that pathologize difference and building support networks that honor neurodivergent lives. That means advocating for neurodivergent therapists and better models of care within the existing system, but also recognizing the importance of support outside of institutions. Grassroots efforts focused on mutual support, resistance, and creating spaces where everyone can thrive.
Wow, so to sum it all up, we've explored this amazing vision of care that embraces neurodivergence, especially the idea of having more autistic therapists. But we also really looked at the systemic barriers that make achieving that vision so hard.
And what we've heard is a powerful argument that the current mental health system might not be broken, it might be working exactly as it was designed, to serve the interests of capital, to pathologize differences that don't fit, and to control those who don't conform.
So if we want to create a truly just and liberatory mental health care system, maybe incremental changes aren't enough. Maybe we need to rethink everything, to dismantle and rebuild based on collective care and a radical acceptance of difference.
It leaves us with a big question to ponder. What would a mental health system that genuinely serves everyone, especially neurodivergent people, actually look like? And how much do our societal and economic systems shape our understanding of mental health and what it means to live a good life?
So much to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been
Sure.
a lot, but really important.